In the polished world of Hollywood, Ron Howard is the ultimate nice guy. We know him as the polite kid from Mayberry and the steady hand behind the camera. But staying at the top for 60 years requires more than just kindness. It requires a thick skin, an unshakable sense of self, and the wisdom to know when to bend and when to stand firm. Behind his famous smile lies a history of difficult sets, clashing egos, and moments that tested everything he thought he knew about the craft. Howard didn't just witness greatness during his remarkable career. He survived it. And the actors who challenged his patience the most became, in their own complicated ways, his greatest teachers. To the millions of Americans who tuned into the Andy Griffith Show during the 60s, Frances Bavier was the personification of domestic warmth. As Aunt B, she was the stabilizing force of Mayberry, a woman whose biggest concerns were the quality of her pickles and the safety of her beloved nephew, Opie. But for the young Ron Howard, the reality of working with Bavier was his first masterclass in the jarring disconnect between a public persona and a private reality. While the world saw a doting aunt who embodied small-town American values, the cast and crew saw something quite different. They saw a classically trained New York stage actress who lived in a state of perpetual, icy professional disdain. Bavier did not see herself as part of an ensemble making a rural comedy. She saw herself as a serious dramatic artist trapped in a medium she considered beneath her considerable talents. This created a unique kind of friction on set, a quiet tension that a child actor like Howard was uniquely sensitive to. In a fictional town like Mayberry, which was built on the foundation of communal love and neighborly warmth, Bavier was an island of professional austerity. She didn't want to be Aunt B once the cameras stopped rolling. She wanted to be respected as the artist she believed herself to be, and she felt that a sitcom about a small-town sheriff was an insult to her theatrical pedigree. Howard has recounted in interviews and in his memoir, The Boys, that Bavier was not a fan of the hijinks that Andy Griffith and Don Knotts engaged in between takes. While the men were laughing and ad-libbing, finding joy in the creative process, Bavier remained rigid and distant. As a child, Howard naturally looked to the adults on set for cues on how to behave, how to understand this strange world of cameras and scripts and pretending. From Griffith, he learned leadership and humor. From Bavier, he learned something darker and more complex. He learned that the person smiling at you in the script might be the one most likely to ignore you the moment the director yelled cut. The tension was not merely atmospheric. It was a wall that Howard could sense but never quite breach. Bavier was deeply offended by the casual, playful nature of the set. She reportedly once took a swing at actor Jim Nabors with an umbrella because his singing annoyed her. For a young Ronnie Howard, this was a confusing introduction to the masks people wear in Hollywood. He had to learn to perform intimacy with a woman who, in reality, offered him nothing but polite distance or visible annoyance. This taught Howard a vital lesson he would carry into his directing career. The performance of chemistry on screen is often an act of sheer will rather than a reflection of genuine affection. You can create magic between two people who have nothing in common, as long as both are committed to the illusion. Bavier's behavior was a manifestation of an older Hollywood mindset, a belief that the craft of acting was a sacred, somber duty that should not be degraded by what she perceived as child's play or rural tropes. She struggled with the fact that, despite her decades of stage work in New York, she would only ever be remembered for a character she essentially despised. This resentment bled into her interactions with everyone on set, including young Howard. She wasn't mean in the traditional sense. She never yelled or threw tantrums. But she was emotionally unavailable, creating a vacuum where a young performer might have expected a mentor or at least a kind word. It was a coldness that forced Howard to grow up faster than he might have otherwise, realizing that a family on screen is often just a collection of strangers holding a contract. This friction reached its peak during the later years of the show. While the rest of the cast remained a tight-knit unit, gathering for dinners and maintaining friendships that would last decades, Bavier retreated further into her shell. She eventually retired to North Carolina after the show ended, becoming a recluse and refusing to participate in many of the reunions that Howard and Griffith cherished. It was a tragic end to a career, defined by a woman who couldn't reconcile her undeniable talent with her unexpected fame. Howard has often spoken of her with a mix of pity and respect, acknowledging that her unhappiness made her difficult to work with, but her discipline made her a consummate professional when the cameras were rolling. By navigating the chilly waters of Bavier's temperament, Howard learned the first rule of Hollywood survival. The character is a performance, and so too is the person playing them. He learned that you could create a masterpiece of warmth while standing in a room full of ice. Bavier was the first person to show him that behind the comforting image of a Hollywood legend, there is often a person struggling with a profound sense of misplaced identity. But if Bavier was a cold breeze in a small town, the next encounter was a hurricane wrapped in silk. If Francis Bavier represented cold, internal resentment, Yul Brynner was the opposite entirely. He was a blazing, external sun that demanded every planet in the room orbit around him. Ron Howard encountered Brynner on the set of the 1959 film The Journey. Howard was only 5 years old, a tiny red-headed boy thrust into the presence of a man who didn't just play kings on screen. He believed he was one in real life. Brynner, famous for his shaved head and his booming, authoritative voice from The King and I, carried an aura of absolute power that made no concessions for anyone, least of all a child actor. Brynner moved through the production with a rigid, terrifying grace. For a child like Howard, who was used to the gentle, paternal guidance of his own father, Rance Howard, Brynner was an alien force. He was a man who didn't speak so much as issue decrees. He didn't walk so much as process, like royalty moving through a court of lesser subjects. Howard recalls being genuinely frightened by Brynner's intensity. The actor had a way of looking through people rather than at them, a technique designed to maintain his status as the most important person in any room. In the world of 50s cinema, stars like Brynner were protected by a studio system that treated them as gods, and Brynner leaned into that divinity with every fiber of his being. Howard watched as adult crew members, seasoned professionals who had worked on dozens of films, scrambled to appease Brynner's every whim. If the lighting wasn't perfect, if a line was flubbed, if the energy on set wasn't exactly to his liking, Brynner's disapproval wasn't expressed through conversation. It was a climate shift that everyone felt in their bones. For Howard, this was a formative experience in understanding how a single ego can hijack a collective creative process. It was the antithesis of the collaborative spirit Howard would later champion as a director. Brynner was an immovable object, a man whose commitment to his own mythology outweighed the comfort of everyone around him. The friction here wasn't born of any personal grudge. It's unlikely Brynner even considered a 5-year-old a peer worth acknowledging. Rather, it was a fundamental clash of philosophies that Howard could sense even at that tender age. Howard was being raised in what might be called a Midwestern style of work. Be prepared, be kind, and be part of the team. Brynner represented something else entirely. Be the spectacle, be the mystery, and be the master. Howard has noted that Brynner's presence was so overwhelming that it felt like the air left the room when he entered. This wasn't just stardom. It was a form of professional tyranny that relied on the subordination of everyone else's identity. Decades later, when Howard transitioned into directing, the ghost of Yul Brynner likely sat on his shoulder as a reminder of what not to do. Howard's sets became famously relaxed and egalitarian, a direct reaction to the emperor model he witnessed in his youth. He learned from Brynner that while fear can produce a powerful performance, it also creates a brittle environment where people are too afraid to take creative risks. Brynner showed him that the icon is often a cage, not just for the people working with them, but for the actor themselves, who must constantly perform their own greatness. Howard's time with Brynner was a baptism by fire. It taught him that Hollywood wasn't just a playground. It was a hierarchy. To survive, one had to learn how to stand their ground in the shadow of a giant. Brynner ruled by sheer presence, but in the 80s, Howard would face a new kind of challenge. The intellectual blockade. By 1982, Ron Howard was at a crossroads in his career. He was no longer the child actor under the thumb of icons. He was a young director trying to prove he had the authority to lead a major feature film. The project was Night Shift, a comedy that required a delicate balance of zany energy and grounded heart. In Shelley Long, Howard found a brilliant comedienne with impeccable timing. but he also encountered an actress whose process was so meticulous and questioning that it threatened to grind the production to a halt. Long came from the rigorous world of Chicago's Second City, a background that emphasized intellectual deconstruction and deep character motivation. While Michael Keaton was improvising at a mile a minute and Henry Winkler was leaning into his natural warmth, Long was often pumping the brakes. She didn't just want to say the lines. She wanted to understand the precise psychological architecture of why her character, Belinda, would choose those specific words in that specific moment. For Howard, this was a crash course in star management. He wasn't just directing a movie. He was negotiating a daily peace treaty between the shooting schedule and a performer's obsessive perfectionism. The friction with Long wasn't born of malice but of a fundamental mismatch in tempo. Howard, having grown up in the high-efficiency world of sitcoms where time is money, valued momentum above almost everything else. Long, conversely, seemed to view the set as a laboratory for endless experimentation. Industry lore and cast reflections from that era often paint a picture of an actress who could be challenging to work with, not because she was a diva demanding special treatment, but because she was a perfectionist who sometimes seemed oblivious to the needs of the ensemble. On the set of Night Shift, this manifested as endless questions and a desire for one more take long after the director was satisfied with what they had captured. Howard had to learn a vital lesson in directorial psychology. The analytical perfectionist isn't trying to be difficult. They are trying to be safe. For Long, the scrutiny of every detail was a shield against failure. But for a director, that shield can become a wall that blocks progress. Howard found himself in a position where he had to validate her concerns without letting them drain the film's energy. This was his first real experience with a situation where an actor uses their intelligence as a form of control. If they can outthink the director, they can effectively seize the creative reins. This experience was a turning point for Howard's leadership style. He realized that being a nice guy wasn't enough. He had to be a clear guy. He learned to set firm boundaries with performers who confused the process with stalling. He also learned to appreciate the result, even when the journey was grueling. Long is undoubtedly brilliant in Night Shift, bringing a vulnerability and depth to Belinda that another actress might have missed entirely. Howard recognized that the friction produced a diamond, but the heat of that friction nearly melted the machine that was supposed to deliver the film on time and on budget. Looking back, the tension with Shelley Long represents a classic directorial dilemma. How much of a star's difficult behavior do you tolerate for the sake of the performance? Long challenged Howard to find his voice as a leader. She showed him that even in a comedy about morgue attendants and unconventional entrepreneurs, the internal psychological battles between director and star are where the real drama lives. She was the first person to show him that the most difficult part of directing isn't the lighting or the script. It's the human ego, often disguised as dedication to the work. If Shelley Long's friction was a slow-motion intellectual grind, Russell Crowe was a lightning strike that could set the whole forest ablaze. By the time Ron Howard cast Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, the actor was already a legend of the mercurial variety, a man whose physical intensity and hair-trigger temperament were as famous as his Oscar-caliber talent. Howard, the perennial seeker of harmony, was suddenly tasked with directing a performer who believed that great art could only be forged in the heat of a high-pressure furnace. This was not merely a clash of styles. It was a collision of temperaments. Crowe brought a method intensity to the set that often translated into a desire for creative involvement in every decision. He didn't just play John Nash. He inhabited him completely, and he expected the production to bend to the needs of that total occupation. Howard has recounted that placement of a seemingly insignificant prop. Crowe was a man who used his intelligence and his considerable physical presence to dominate any space he entered. On the set of A Beautiful Mind, and later Cinderella Man, the creative tension was palpable. Crowe was known for a short fuse during this era, famously getting into an altercation with a producer at an awards show, and that volatility followed him onto the soundstage. For Howard, managing Crowe was a lesson in handling brilliance. He realized that with certain actors, the difficulty isn't a lack of professionalism. It's an excess of commitment, a dedication so deep and consuming that it becomes potentially destructive to the social fabric of the crew. Howard had to provide enough space for Crowe's genius to roam without letting it overwhelm the supporting cast or derail the schedule. The friction was ultimately about boundaries. Crowe would push, and Howard, in his quiet but surprisingly firm way, had to push back. It was a high-stakes negotiation played out over months of filming, where the currency was mutual respect. One of the most instructive examples of this dynamic occurred when Crowe insisted on shooting A Beautiful Mind in chronological order, a logistical nightmare for any production. Howard initially resisted, citing the practical realities of filmmaking and budget constraints. But Crowe was relentless. He argued that the psychological deterioration of John Nash couldn't be authentically captured by jumping around the timeline. In a rare move, Howard pivoted. He saw that Crowe wasn't being difficult for the sake of ego. He was being difficult for the sake of truth. This was the turning point in their relationship. Howard learned that with a volatile genius, you don't try to extinguish the fire. You learn to channel it toward the work. However, the psychological toll on Howard was significant. Unlike his sets with Tom Hanks or Steve Martin, where the atmosphere was one of light-hearted collaboration and genuine fun, the Crowe sets were heavy with intensity. There were days of silence, days of heated debate, and days where the air felt thick with the leading man's dissatisfaction. Howard had to develop a new kind of directorial resilience, one that could absorb the blows of a mercurial star's moods without showing bruises. He learned that some actors don't want a nice director. They want a partner who is as obsessed with perfection as they are. This period marked Howard's transition from being a director of movies to being a director of performances. By surviving the fire of Russell Crowe, he proved he could handle the most volatile elements Hollywood had to offer. He recognized that difficult temperament is often just the shadow cast by immense talent. Crowe pushed Howard out of his comfort zone, forcing him to abandon the safety of his genial persona and become a leader who could command a room through sheer competence and intellectual stamina. Howard and Crowe emerged from their collaborations as friends and would work together multiple times, but the lessons of those early creative battles remained foundational to Howard's approach. Managing a genius is a marathon. Managing a tragedy, however, is a heartbreak that tests the soul. Tom Sizemore was one of the industry's most sought-after tough guys during the late 90s and early 2000s.